This is the Books Podcast presented by Tim Hague.
It didn't matter what any critic says about Dan Brown. That book broke sales records on the day it went on sale. The hero or heroine has to have a distinctive mark.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
Interview commenced at 15:15. Present Barry Forshaw and Tim Hague. For the tape, Barry, please confirm that you are indeed Barry Forshaw.
I am Barry Forshaw.
You understand why you're here. You've written a book called Crime Fiction, A Reader's Guide, and you have waived your right to a solicitor. For the tape, I am showing Barry a copy of his book. Is this the book, Barry?
It is, but I was persuaded to do it. It was against my will.
That's what they all say. It's what it is. It's called a reader's guide, and so let's talk a little about the nature of the book. It's not a history. It's almost a reference book, although it's well enough written that it doesn't. You could read it from front to back like I did.
Well, I was trying to do that and what make it function on both levels. As you say, it is a reference guide. It's a shopping list. Over the years, I noticed that a lot of people would, when they asked to sign books of mine, they'd show me the index, which was full of pencil ticks or even pen ticks, and they'd used it as a shopping list. And I thought, well, finally, why not do one which is designed to do just that? And if you need to know what Raymond Chandler book to read or what Agatha Christie, it will be here.
And you do plump as well. You do tell us which is the book for each author as a sort of way in, or maybe the best one.
Well, that's not very easy. It's easy if you go to, say, Chandler, who I just mentioned, because it is the big sleep. It's the first one. And,
it is, and that is the best one.
And still the best, I agree.
Yeah.
And
although his others are all worth reading. They're all wonderful.
But Fleming, you would possibly say Casino Royale, which is his best written book.
You would, although I don't like that one. I never liked Casino. And I always thought Fleming was overrated.
Do you? Well, I'll still like you despite saying that. Actually, it's funny because an earlier edition of this book, which was done for Penguin, and a line was added about Fleming by a sub-editor, rather saying, Tim, what you just said. And I said, sorry, I didn't say this. I said, I did say he's a popular writer, but a supremely gifted popular writer. He's got his limitations. Of course he has.
Of course, yeah.
But I didn't, they'd added a line about him being stodgy or something along those lines. And I took exception to that. And they said the sub-editor felt you were praising him too highly.
Well, you are awfully good-natured. I mean, you do look for the good in all of these writers.
And I thought, and also in the case of a book like this, although there are dissenting notes throughout, it's not there to do any hatchet jobs on people.
Absolutely. I think about the rudest thing you say about anybody is about Jack Higgins. You said that he's got all the customary tangled plotting bursts of action and a studied avoidance of nuance, which made me laugh.
Now, I'm glad that you spotted that, Tim, because that's been my writing style over the years, and people who know me in the I or the FT will know that's... That line hopefully is eloquent.
You will
you'll get what I'm saying.
Yeah,
but I'm not going to do it.
You're not there to destroy anybody, are you?
And basically, I don't want to. If they're in the book, you'll find that there are people who are in the book only peripherally. That's also a factor. And in fact, not just me, but if you look at any major crime reviewer, when they start to synopsize the plot and don't tell you much about the book, you can read between the lines.
Yes, of course. So, I obviously, my approach to every book is that I start at the beginning or read all the way through. This one you really could drop through, and you've put in an index in case people want to. And I have to confess, I couldn't resist it. As I was reading about one, I wonder what he's got to say about... I don't know, Christopher Fowler, Raymond Chandler, anybody, and I could not resist going and finding them in the index.
Well, the main thing is that I tried to get in as many crime writers as I could, not just the golden age, but current crime writers, and that's difficult.
It is because it's a wonderfully comprehensive book, but even then you can't do everything.
You can't do everything. But I've noticed that a lot of writers said to me, yes, Andrew Taylor said I bought it. And guess what I did first? I turned to the index.
Of course.
Well, you'd expect that, so fair enough.
If I had published a crime book, I would have turned to the index first as well. I mean, and inevitably, you look through and you go, oh, he hasn't got so-and-so.
Yes.
But you've done an encyclopedia of British crime writers.
But even
before.
that had its emissions too. You really can't win, even with this book, for instance, because I had a set word count. I looked at certain writers, like a writer called Caleb Carr, And he'd
Who
written
wrote
the book,
The Aliens?
Well,
Yes,
you
I
remember The
remember.
Alien.
I read it.
You
And
know your stuff.
Yeah, there was another one.
But the career had seemed to stall. And just as I decided, right, if I'm going to get rid of some people, it has to be him, the TV series began. So Caleb Carr went back in. But there are writers who are forgotten. Having said that, there's a writer, Tim, have you heard of a writer called Alan Williams?
Now, him I don't know.
Okay, nobody does these days except people of my age, I think. He's the son of Emlyn Williams, the actor, who was
That's
also
right.
a writer.
And he's in the book, yeah.
He's in the book. And Alan Williams is a really good writer with a very Eric Ambler-like vivid adventure stories, espionage. And I thought the books, some of them being reprinted, let's put that in for somebody who doesn't just want to read about Christie and Dashiell Hammett. So hopefully there are discoveries for people.
Oh, I'm sure there are, because I don't know how many. You probably have an idea of how many writers you've been able to reference, but there are.
I lost track.
Oh, did you? Because there are hundreds and hundreds.
Yeah,
I mean,
people were coming in and going out, and then even right up to the line, the publisher was saying, "Have you got this person in?" And I, yes. So people were being added and subtracted right to the end, mostly added.
I looked for Mark Gatiss because I liked his. Do you remember his Lucifer box?
Yes.
He wrote 3 books about a very, very camp Victorian sleuth called Lucifer Box. He didn't make it.
No, he didn't make, and he was on in the cut at one point. So, for instance, Kim Newman, who's a friend of Mark's, and Kim writes about Sherlock Holmes, as does Mark, of course. He made the cut just because I think he's still read more than Mark's books are. Aficionados like yourself know about those books of Mark, but they're kind of not that well known.
No, they're not. So, apart from, we were talking about the nature of the book, and we said it's not encyclopedic. What you have done though is, as well as strictly crime books, you've included thrillers, and I as I was starting to read it, I thought, I'm going to query him about that.
Right.
Why do we have thrillers as well? Not that I have anything against thrillers, but if you're going to leave out certain crime books,
Because I think, well, you could say that if you put in, there are certain thriller writers. For instance, Eric Ambler is in there. Now, is Eric Ambler a crime writer or a thriller writer? Over the years, he was marketed as both. When I did The Guardian, which I don't do these days so much, I would discuss with Laura Wilson, who did crime. I did thrillers for them. We would decide what the difference between a crime novel and a thriller was. Do you know what our definition was?
I'm going to.
Okay, you will. We decided that the stakes had to be higher in a thriller. There had to be a virus that would wipe out everyone in London, and that had to be found. In a crime novel, it's usually smaller. Usually they're not global.
Somebody's getting killed.
Yeah, somebody's getting it. And also in terms of violence, so in a crime novel, the detective will be in threat, danger of his life towards the end. In a thriller, it's throughout. It's from chapter 1 onwards and so forth. But also the main reason, Tim, is I don't really welcome the distinction.
Okay.
I think it's too difficult
Good
to
enough
draw
for me.
it in many books. Is it crime
Well,
novel?
you're right. No, of course, there are lots of books that, or thrillers within which crimes are committed. And
Yes.
where are we at then? What is this?
But you could take a book like Rogue Mail by Geoffrey Household, which I'm sure you know. That is clearly a thriller because it's the hero is on the run, he goes to Earth, he's being chased by Nazis and so forth. That's clear there. But there are other books where the distinction is not so clear.
We touched on the question of quality. And how nice you are about everybody. Some of these writers, though, you must be able to see are not up to stuff. I made a note of Dan Brown because you include him.
How did I know you were going to start talking about Dan Brown, Tim?
Well, yes, but I mean, I did read the what was it called?
The Da Vinci
Da
Code.
Vinci Code,
Yes.
which I thought was subliterate.
Yes.
I thought it was like a 400-page film treatment, and it made a good film. How much do you feel a responsibility to distinguish between? I don't know. You've got Graham Greene in here. You've
Yes.
got John le Carré.
Who are probably
Wonderful
slightly
novelists,
better writers.
Wonderful
Yes.
novelists.
In fact, the best. As you, in
Graham
terms
Greene,
of
greatest novelist of the 20th century.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah.
And John le Carré actually first rate. So I mean, you do, and Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett. We cover an enormous canvas here.
But Dan Brown's interesting you say that because I've had to cover one of his books, The Lost Symbol. I was reviewing it for a newspaper. It arrived on a milk run. I had to have it delivered in the wee small hours. I knew it was arriving at 2:00 because I had to deliver the copy the next day. And I remember writing when I wrote that, it didn't matter what any critic says about Dan Brown. That book broke sales records on the day it went on sale. So you could also argue, and I'm being generous here, you've accused me of being generous, I'm going to agree with it, that he must be doing something right, because you will find an awful lot of people who won't agree with your distinction, which is, I think, the correct one. But he's doing something right because people are reading him and loving his books.
There is something to be said for being a page turner.
Yes, which he certainly is.
You know,
I mean, you're right about the lack of style. It's kind of a mess stylistically, but it is a page turner, and that's a virtue.
Of course it is. And it turns into a decent film when you do that
indeed.
as well. Before we talk about films, I want to talk about the heroes within these books. If you've got a successful hero, you're made. They become icons of popular culture. Sherlock Holmes is obviously going to be our sort of starting point, but there are lots of other. But what is it? What makes a hero so memorable?
Well, there's a writer who is, I said earlier how it was my job to get people reading Alan Williams.
Yeah.
The other person I think people should be reading, and I hope you have, Tim, and if you haven't, start, which is Ross MacDonald.
No, I haven't. Oh.
And you like Chandler.
Yes.
Well, he's different.
You know, I haven't read Jim Thompson either, but I'm going to. But Ross MacDonald, tell me about
Ross MacDonald, very prolific writer. You'll see that on my shelves there. It's a great swathe of them. He's like Chandler. He has a tough private eye who's a bit of a cheat, because Marlowe is an unreal figure, really. He's this kind of slightly poetic knight errant with a gift for badinage. He's also a tough, and Chandler was aware such a man was not real, not real. Ross MacDonald's hero, Lou Archer, however, is more of a psychologist. The books are an examination of the psychology of family and society, and they're all wonderful books. What makes him distinctive is this fact that he examines the American nuclear family in a way that Chandler didn't do. That wasn't Chandler's interest at all. Yeah.
A family for Chandler was some old bloke in a mansion and a wayward daughter or two.
Yes, quite.
That was his idea.
But I think you get those. The hero or heroine has to have a distinctive mark, and the trouble now is that they've all been done to death. So you can't anymore say feisty female anthropologist or forensic scientist.
It's been done.
There are just too many.
Yeah, Patricia Cornwell's had one, and
but exactly. But in fact, it started with an earlier writer, Ed McBain, of course.
Yes,
he was. I did an interview with him years ago. He was quite annoyed that there were so many women, not mainly women, writing about forensic scientists. He did it first, but didn't see. I said, well, they spotted that this was a gap in the market and parlayed it into this great success. The trouble, I'd say another problem is with a hero, to answer your question, is every trope has been examined and done, so it's basically variations on the theme.
Yeah. And everybody will try and think of a USP. You've got Jeff Lindsay with his Dexter,
yes.
the serial killer who works as a forensic scientist, which made actually a jolly good TV show.
A clever idea.
The TV show was a lot better than the book.
Yes.
But that happens sometimes. We might come back to that as well. I wanted to ask you about Maigret. I've come to Simenon late. In the past few years, I've read a handful, actually quite a lot. Maigret, Simenon has a genius for almost not telling you anything, but by the end you know.
It's not surprising that so many writers like André Gide and Aldous Huxley were great admirers of his. And you feel that if Hemingway had read him, for precisely the reasons you just gave, he would have admired him, because everything is stripped to the bone.
Yeah, and
I couldn't. If I wrote a crime novel, which I don't, I have no interest in doing so, I couldn't write like that. I would be adding filigrees and riffs and scene descriptions. He doesn't do that. He does just the minimum that's required. The interesting thing about Simenon is the fact that people often say to me, I read one novel and it wasn't, it was good, but it wasn't that special. I think you need to read a lot of Simenon.
I think you do.
And then you get the sense of what he's doing throughout 75 books.
Yeah, and he sort of... He doesn't... almost nothing happens, and yet by the end it's all happened.
Yes, exactly.
It's a really clever trick.
Well, Penguin, of course, have reissued all 75 in new translations. And what's quite interesting is that the new translators, possibly because they're all younger and they're contemporaries, have removed one element which doesn't wear well in Simenon, which is this slight element of anti-Semitism. which is in the books. So I think there's a description of one of the Jewish characters in one of them, I can't remember which one, where she is described as having a Semitic turn of feature. It's not necessarily racist, but now the line brings you up short. And I think the new translation says something like she had dark features. And I found myself thinking, I don't know, you've got to take it on board. It's Simenon.
I want to ask about that because there is always a lot of books have gone out of print, and sometimes we're bringing them back into print. I'm not sure all of them deserve to be brought back into print. Simenon, certainly, but again, I would want the text that was there.
Yes, absolutely. Well, you mentioned the greatest British novelist, Graham Greene. There is definitely a strain of anti-Semitism in his work. John Buchan earlier has the problems, but you could go into poetry, couldn't you? So Larkin has some very strongly anti-Semitic lines. Eliot, Pound. All of these great writers are not ideal in their thinking. And Virginia Woolf, who believed, as did H.G. Wells, in eugenics. So these writers, do we not read them anymore the way we're supposed to cast out people now because they've had sexual indiscretions? Do we just cancel them? I'm not one for cancelling writers or filmmakers.
No, and yet that is very much the spirit of the age. But there's a lot of well, we were talking about heroes. A lot of heroes who have been lost or not so much lost, but forgotten. If they're remembered at all, they're remembered from films. You know, your Richard Hannays in the 39 Steps and your Sappers, Bulldog Drummond. I mean,
well, it's interesting.
Nobody reads Bulldog
It's interesting
Drummond
you should say that because the kernel of the Crime Fiction Reader's Guide was a book I did for Penguin years ago called Rough Guide to Crime Fiction, which is kind of basically just a tiny fragment of this. At the time, the first editor for the book said to me, "Why have you got Sapper in there?" And I said, well, because, there'd be no James Bond. He's the first Clubland hero, Bulldog Drummond. As a pause, and he said to me, well, wasn't Sapper an anti-Semitic old bastard? I said, well, yes, but nevertheless, we can't write him out of history. Take him out. A new editor came on the book, and he said to me, you're talking about espionage, but you don't seem to mention Sapper. I said, well, and I think we can't rewrite history that these people existed. I was very sorry then Richard Hannay, as you mentioned him, for the years in the West End, the 39 Steps was treated with contempt, really. A Clubland hero was a figure of fun. And I want Hannay to be a hero you can still...
hero.
You can still invest in.
Robert Donat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, all right, there are things that date. The Clubland attitudes date. But that's okay. We can take them on board. Where readers are generally more intelligent, we can put things into context, can't we?
I'm going to get into trouble with you again. I wasn't a big admirer of the 39 Steps either.
The novel. Interesting that. Whereas to me, that's still one of the great British novels with a great sense of place. You mentioned you like Rogue Mail, which also has a similar...
The Geoffrey Household book.
Yeah, has a same sense of place. And I think actually going back to what you said about thrillers, that's crucial to a thriller. The sense of
and crime as well. It's quite interesting that crime writers tend very, very much to lodge their heroes in a particular milieu. People will sort of adopt or I don't know, annex a place. There are lots of London crime writers, but there'll be somebody who's doing crime in Blackpool somewhere.
Yes, pretty well everywhere. Well, I know a writer.
You've got Rebus up in Scotland.
There was a Welsh writer I knew some years ago who said that he had real difficulty getting his books published because nobody assumed that Wales had any crime. Scotland, fine. Edinburgh, rife with crime. London, as you say. And now there are Welsh crime writers.
I bet there's one who's specific to the Gower Peninsula.
I'm sure there is. And there's almost not, it's like with historical crime, there is not a period of history where there hasn't been an anachronistic detective plumped down. Lindsay Davis writes wonderful books about Falco.
Right, yeah.
There were no detectives in ancient Rome. She knows perfectly well there weren't. So she creates a man who can function as an investigator.
But, we accept that because it's a convention. After all, crime novels, more than as what we're going to call literary fiction, insofar as you can distinguish them, crime novels are a machine. They have to work in a particular way, don't they?
That's well put. They're a machine, and the components have to be there. Like a symphony has to have a structure, and sonata form in music. So crime thrillers have to have that same structure. We do demand it, which you wouldn't necessarily from literary fiction.
And they have to work through the tropes, and they have to work through to their conclusion. in the right way, don't they?
Yes.
You can't go too.
Well, you couldn't write a novel like Ulysses. So you have, if Joyce is saying, well, it's about a man in Dublin in 1904, tries to sell some advertising while his wife is screwing a tenor. What a great plot that is. That's wonderful. That's clearly going to be the novel of the 20th century, but it was. So whereas a crime novel can do that, although you can experiment with the form.
The place, though, is I'm going to suggest is as important as the hero for most crime novels. Evoking a sense of place seems to be something that they all need to do. I mean, I could do example. I read a lot of Janet Ivanovich, those sort of comedy crime things that she sets in New Jersey, in Trenton, I think, isn't it? It's an actual place in New, and you know that the location is Chandler in Los Angeles. You couldn't take these characters out of there and make it work.
James Elroy later. So many writers have
Carl
colonised
Hiaasen in Florida, although he does.
However, having said that, it's quite interesting. That's something that I spotted. I've written quite a few books on Scandinavian crime, and I'm kind of regarded as the Scandinavian guy, unless somebody else has got who's biting at my heels. And I realised something about a lot of Scandinavian crime novels is that they don't have a great sense of place. We assume they do because we're filtering in what we've seen on TV.
Yeah, we see Wallander or the girl with the dragon tattoo.
Yeah, all of that is so. But I was reading several writers and thinking, actually, this could be Manchester or Birmingham. There's not a great sense of place, but as you're reading Scandinavian crime fiction, you're filling it in mentally. And as you said earlier, some writers like Simonon can just use a few words and they've got a sense of place.
You make a reference to Martin Cruz Smith and Gorky Park. He makes that fantastically vivid. That Moscow setting is extremely vivid. It's not that you can't do it; you can't make people shiver while they're reading it.
But he's done something else. Going back to what you said about the characteristics of the hero, he's part of a movement which is to have the honest, noble. That's the wrong word, but the honest cop in a corrupt regime. Which has been done so often now, but the best of them is Renko in the Martin Cruz Smith books.
You remind me when you refer to the Nordic thrillers and the Nordic noir that I have read the Stieg Larsson trilogy, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, and so on. And of course, they're being continued by somebody else.
Yes, David Lagercrantz.
Now, how do we feel about that? Because it's not that unusual. Mike Ripley's doing Campion, the Marjorie Allingham character. We've got Sophie Hannah, I think, is writing Poirot, isn't she? Everybody whose brother's done James Bond.
Yes, quite. Although the best of them is still Kingsley Amis, the first one.
That's
Robert
right.
Markham,
yes.
as he called him.
Most of the others actually don't come off, I think.
Well, the David Lagercrantz is an interesting one. I've met him a few times. He's a very interesting character, very lively, very energetic figure. I never met Stieg Larsson, although I did write the first biography shortly.
Well, he died at 50, didn't he?
Yes, he did. Yeah. Yes, he had the classic lifestyle of the journalist, which is pizzas and 60 cigarettes a day and totally sedentary. Unlike you and I, who are in the peak of physical fitness.
Yes, but Adonises sitting here.
But David Lagercrantz, I noticed about the first book. I said, "Where is the massive sexual violence?" And he said, "Well, do you really want that?" I said, "Well, no, I'm just saying that that's what powers the three Stieg Larsson books. She is kind of a serial victim. She is what English judges once would have said is a woman who's asking for it. She's raped so often. But it's actually a tactic by Stieg Larsson to give this revenge motif. If you mess with Lisbeth Salander, you will pay a bloody heavy price." David Lagercrantz said, "I wasn't interested in dealing with the sexual violence, and it had been done so much. But by doing that, he makes her slightly less interesting. In those three books, she's a very damaged woman. And by the end of it, she's achieved some kind of equilibrium. If she carries on, she's just another heroine, dare I say it."
You had fun writing this book. And one of the things you've done is you've also referenced the screen adaptations. And of course you have, because there's no way of getting away from the symbiosis between crime and thrillers and screen adaptations. How do you feel when they change the hero I mean, I always thought Inspector Morse was very different in the books than he was on television. You mentioned Jonathan Gash's Lovejoy, who's not the same as he is on TV, they made a film of Lawrence Block's burglar books, where Bernie Rodenbauer, a middle-aged Jewish guy who's a burglar, was played by Whoopi Goldberg.
Yes.
How do we feel about that? Well, it's changed the character.
It essentially doesn't matter. Lee Child's
Jack Reacher.
Well, Lee Child
played by Tom Cruise. Tiny little actor, no bigger than your thumb.
I did say to Lee fairly early on, and his publisher was worried because she was standing next to him. I said, "So how tall is Tom Cruise again?" And he didn't answer. He knew exactly where he was going. He said, "Do you think Tom Cruise is a good actor?" I said, "Yes, of course he is. Rain Man proved he's a really good actor as well as a star." And he said, "So people will go and see those movies. They won't blame me." He said, and as Stephen King has said, my books are still on the shelf. Whatever happens to them in the films, nobody blames me for that. And of course, I actually think Jack Reacher is being recast for the TV series now. So, yes. But I think it's inevitable. Any film of a book is going to do major surgery, sometimes for the better. So The Godfather, for instance, is a better, richer film than the book.
Where is crime fiction going? Has it run its course? You said that all the tropes have been used. So is there anything left to do?
It's very difficult, isn't it? There are still some new notions that suddenly appear. An English writer, fellow Liverpudlian of mine, Imran Mahmood, wrote a book in which the central character, the whole book, is the defense statement of a young black guy who's up for a crime, and it hadn't been done before. But the trouble is, the trope that's most common now in domestic noir is the woman who finds that her husband may have been a killer and the marriage may be built on a lie, which actually, of course, is Jane Eyre and is also Rebecca. So, okay, people are still buying that in the thousands. Or the other current trope that I get every other book is a group of friends meet after 30 years ago. They went on holiday once and one of their number died. And it's actually a horror film. I saw what you did last summer. It was actually done in horror films before. But now it's become the ultimate cliche. Donna Tartt did the novel, of course, of the friends who cover up a murder and pay a heavy price for it years later. I think the problem is there's such a demand for product. There's so many books out there.
It's not like there's any slowdown, is it?
No, it isn't. But clearly it is possible for new books to appear. Gone Girl is a good example, which do something different and something original. A writer called Abia Mukherjee, young Anglo-Asian writer, his books have an English investigative figure with a Asian, they're set at the time of the Raj, an Asian assistant. But what he cleverly does is he makes the Asian assistant, who you think is the Watson figure, is actually the cleverer of the two.
Finally, I've got one more question, which I've always wanted to know the answer to. Why do readers of crime fiction, so much more than other readers, why do they love long series about the same detective so much? Because crime is noted for these long strings of novels about the same.
Isn't it
era.
because not so much in this era, but in any era, they function as like comfort food. So, for instance, if you turn on television, you will find an episode of Only Fools and Horses or an episode of Friends playing.
Or Murder, She Wrote.
Or Murder, She Wrote. That's a good example. You know exactly where you are with each of those. And in fact, you would watch 5-10 minutes of one of those shows, even if you'd seen it or not seen it, because you know exactly what the milieu is, you know what the dynamic between the characters is. I think it is that. It's the fact that we like to... why you say about James Bond, so many people have tackled James Bond. To a degree, Bond's continuing success as a literary character is because he is a bit of a blank, because Fleming calls him a blunt instrument for the state and doesn't characterize him too much beyond that, apart from the accoutrements, what he likes to eat and drink and the women he sleeps with. But there's also the satisfying sense of closure that all crime fiction gives us.
Murder is comforting.
It is. Well, also, it's the simple, in our lives, I'm sure it's happened to you, Tim, there are people who annoy us. And so what we have to do is bite our tongue. And we can't usually say what we really want. So crime fiction, I think that's the main function of crime fiction, the catharsis. Even the cozy crime, somebody dies violently. And we can enjoy that while we wouldn't dream of doing it ourselves, hopefully. but we can enjoy the catharsis and the closure that a crime novel brings.
Well, that's brings a closure to our interview as well, which is terminated at, oh no, who knows. Barry, thank you very much. I really enjoyed crime fiction.
Thank you, Tim.
Crime Fiction, A Reader's Guide by Barry Forshaw is published by Oldcastle Books at £12.99. That was Books Podcast, presented by Tim Haig. Books Podcast is a Green Shoot production. You can find out more at www.green-shoot.com, and Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.